Well, good evening. Thank you all very much for coming out tonight or staying in to be with us. On behalf of Sacristy Press, I'd like to welcome you all. My name is Natalie Watson, and I'm the publishing director of Sacristy Press. Sacristy Press is a publisher based in Durham. In fact, it's the only publisher based in Durham. And one of the great things about working for Sacristy Press, which is a growing, emerging, up and coming publisher of theology, history, and much besides, is that I get to read a lot of very interesting books before other people read them. And over the last year and a bit, it has been my great pleasure to work with Gillian Warson on her book, Using Vintage Hymns in Worship, Hidden Treasures Rediscovered for Today's Church, which we've come together tonight to launch. So before we talk about the book and find out more about using vintage hymns in church, in worship, I'd like to introduce you to Sacristy Press. If you would like to find out more about us, find out maybe about some of the other interesting, exciting books that we've published and that we're about to publish, then please go to our website, sacristy.co.uk, or follow us on, find us on Facebook, like us on Facebook even, or follow us on Twitter, and you'll be kept informed about all the exciting new books that we've got in the pipeline, or maybe find some hidden treasures of Sacristy Press that we've published. But tonight we've come together to celebrate one of our recent books. As I said, using vintage hymns in worship. I don't know what you've missed in the last 16 months. One of the things I've certainly missed a lot is singing in church, singing hymns, singing the old favourites. And I was in a big church in London the other day, and a well-known hymn, which is very dear to my heart, was the final hymn. It was supposed to be sung by the chorus, just by the choir, but actually it wasn't just my lips that were moving. So I think that's saying something. But of course, sometimes when you haven't got something, when you're missing something, that's also an opportunity to think again what it is that you're missing, or that maybe you haven't discovered about those hidden treasures. So I'd like to introduce to you Michael Garland. Michael is an ordained Anglican minister who began singing hymns when he joined the local church choir at the age of 8. And he still enjoys active ministry in retirement and is currently treasurer of the Hymn Society of Great Britain and Ireland. So, Michael, I'm sure this is a topic that is also very dear to your heart. So I'm looking forward to hearing you and Gillian Warson, the author of a book, in conversation about this little book. If by the end of today, or even during the launch, your appetite's been whetted, then please visit our website, or tomorrow morning go to your local bookshop. The book is available from the Sacristy Press website, and of course also in all good bookshops, Christian and otherwise. They can order it for you, and you'll have it in a few days, and you will have a very enjoyable read, I think, as I've worked with Gillian on the book. So over to you, Michael and Gillian. Tell us more about using vintage hymns in worship.
For your book, and I enjoyed reading it very much indeed. I think you're going to begin this session with an introduction that you've prepared.
So thank you very much, Natalie and Michael, for that warm introduction. It's a great pleasure to talk about my book, Using Vintage Hymns in Worship, and also generally to talk about hymns, because I adore hymns. I adore singing hymns. I adore finding out about hymns. And I really enjoy sharing what I found out about hymns and my own opinions on the subject. Of course, we all like sharing our own opinions. Let's think about vintage. It's a much used word, and perhaps it's actually an overused word, because we all know what vintage means when it refers to clothes or even furniture. But is it really a useful word to apply to our hymns? Let's consider what we might actually mean by a vintage hymn. We all agree that the term is generally applied to something that's old, but it can still perform its original function. So does that mean then that all old hymns are vintage hymns? No, it doesn't, because this defines their original function too narrowly. The purpose of a hymn, of course, as Natalie has already shared with us, is not merely to sing, but that in singing, it confirms our faith by firing our imagination and touching our hearts. And clearly, not all hymns are vintage in that sense. A hymn ceases to be vintage and becomes merely old-fashioned when it expresses ideas to which we no longer wish to subscribe. How can we, for example, with a clear conscience, continue to sing hymns which refer to only men and brothers, thus ignoring half the human race? What about hymns that glorify earthly battles and those which favour one race above others? There's certainly plenty to think about, and all this before we've considered the difficulties of changing language. It is, though, I believe, possible to answer these questions, and in doing so, bring freshness and vibrancy to our vintage hymns. One of the reasons why singers may be disinclined to sing a given hymn is because they associate it with the jingoistic enthusiasm for colonialism and the superiority of the white races. We can all remember in the summer of 2020, for example, there raged a fierce battle about the inclusion of certain texts in the last night of the proms, with strong opinions voiced on either side. At its most basic, the two opposing factions were divided between tradition, i.e., we've always done it this way, and the desire for change, i.e., these texts are no longer appropriate. This debate mirrors the recent controversy over public monuments that celebrate the lives of people whose achievements are no longer admired, and indeed perhaps positively reviled. Likewise, there is a choice between holding on to treasured texts, suspect as they may be, and committing ourselves to their radical revision. We need to ask ourselves whether an inclusive church can countenance hymns which express these questionable attitudes. For example, what of the sentiment so favoured by Victorian hymn writers that God, as a white Englishman, favoured Britons over other nations? Hills of the North Rejoice, for example, is a hymn much loved for its beautiful language. But in the original, the constant references to missionary and evangelistic purposes are now seen as outdated by many singers. Another feature which may lead us to look askance at a vintage hymn is the attitude it expresses towards warfare. Hymns often contain military images, but this can leave us uncertain as to whether they represent a fight in the spiritual realm or conflict on the actual battlefield. It's difficult to disentangle these two interpretations, and sometimes a text, such as Onward Christian Soldiers, has been used to fire our military ardour, even though the author intended it to refer to a purely spiritual battle. The strong association with the military is but one of the instances that gender stereotyping has come under scrutiny in hymns. And this is another reason the suitability of some of our older hymns is called into question. It's only in the latter half of the 20th century that patriarchy in the church has become widely challenged. In our vintage hymns, All too often, women are presented in a passive role, with men seen as the bold activists. All too often, the use of masculine specific language is used in connection with winning the battle of salvation. Examples of the assumed bravery of the men are apparent in texts like Norman MacLeod's "Courage, brother, do not stumble," and of course, the popular hymn "He Who Would Valiant Be" by Percy Dermer. Some people then would even claim that there are no old hymns which can fully serve our needs as worshippers in the 21st century. Now I'd like to offer some thoughts on how we can fully integrate our older hymns into our current worship. One solution is to alter or adapt a text. Altering a familiar text can be something of a minefield and is certainly anathema to purists. It is certainly the case, though, that a now unappealing sentiment can be replaced by careful writing with a convincing alternative. Thomas Carlyle's hymn, "A Safe Stronghold, Our God is Still," is valued because of the reputation of the writer. Yet it contains a verse that suggests that wives and children are mere possessions and assigns a role to women that implies an unfavourable comparison to men. This troublesome verse has been rewritten by Rupert E. Davis and is increasingly the preferred version. Perhaps it's one of the joys of hymn singing that we can keep revisiting and re-evaluating our favourites. This is where the idea of vintage can take on a new meaning. We think nothing of changing the trimmings of an old-fashioned outfit to bring it up to date, or we may find a completely new use for a piece of china. This is exactly how contemporary hymn writers treat some of our vintage texts. Inspired by the original words, they approach the text in a new way, sometimes even rearranging the verses. A popular example is Stuart Townend's "The Lord's My Shepherd, I'll Not Want," which is frequently sung as an alternative to Francis Rouse's much-loved versification of the 23rd Psalm. The result is exciting in that it will be both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. The original text remains vivid in the mind of the singer, but the new text offers a fresh resonance. Another way that a text could be reworked is when the writer takes a familiar hymn and weaves other words, perhaps even complete verses, into it, as can be seen in the many versions of John Newton's vintage hymn, "Amazing Grace," which appears in many new hymn books. Once more, this allows the singer to join in with familiar words, but with the broadening effect of a different point of view. These examples show that a new version does not replace the old version, but allows those with different musical tastes to discover and appreciate it. So, vintage hymn singing is a complex subject. More important, though, is the fact that when we sing hymns together, we are joined together, shoulder to shoulder in solidarity. Natalie's already mentioned that it's been so sad to see how the COVID-19 pandemic has robbed us of this collective activity and swept away centuries of tradition in a few short months. Entry to churches remains restricted, although hopefully not so much after today, and services have been largely relegated to the internet, and group singing is limited. We are social beings, and a vital part of our cultural identity is maintained by the activities we pursue together, and this includes singing hymns. Even the hymns which trouble us can, in their shortcomings, throw a spotlight on attitudes and prejudices that were once widely shared and created few qualms in the singers of the time they were written. Not only do these hymns reveal our past attitudes, they can also serve as a warning not to let ourselves acquire new prejudices as pernicious as those we now reject. The vintage hymns, including those in an altered form, which express sentiments which we endorse wholeheartedly, are important, not only because they enshrine moral or religious truths, but also because they allow us to give voice to the beliefs, our beliefs, in the company of others. Thank you.
Gillian, thank you very much for that splendid introduction. You and I have enjoyed many good conversations about hymns over many years, and hopefully that will continue this evening. But just to encourage those who are tuning in this evening, if any of you would like to ask Gillian a question, then you can actually do that by accessing the chat facility on whatever you're watching on, and hopefully that will come up and we'll be able to put those questions to Gillian later on. But Gillian, thank you again. So glad you mentioned one or two of my favourite hymns there. Hills of the North Rejoice. I've loved that hymn ever since I joined the church choir when I was 8 years old, with its rousing tune. But of course, that hymn became largely unsingable as we realized that it contained some rather patronizing attitudes to people living in different countries and in different cultures. It was very successfully revised, a light revision, you might say, I think about 45 years ago. That's one of the things that can happen, isn't it, to vintage hymns where perhaps some of the language is no longer fashionable or worthy to be sung. That's a great example, I think. Would you agree?
Yes, I certainly would. I mean, Hills of the North Rejoice, I think perhaps some of us may well be showing our age when we remember singing it in the school assembly, and that last verse, "Shout as you journey home," and I don't think we would really have particularly thought back all those decades ago that we were singing anything wrong. But I really don't think that we would want to sing those original verses now, and I think it's a really good example of a sensitive rewriting, reusing. And of course, the most essential thing about the rewriting is it has kept the same tune. So we can still enjoy this rousing call to worship and still use it as an Advent hymn with the same excitement and enthusiasm as our young selves did. And I think one of the things about vintage hymns is they join our older, more thoughtful selves with our younger enthusiasm, and they can do that by using the same tune. They can use it by using aspects of the familiar words, and I think all this is an important part of thinking about vintage hymn singing.
Yeah, thank you. I think in some of our vintage hymns, we find phrases or words that are quite difficult, or perhaps some theological concepts that are quite difficult, perhaps, to sing about. And often we can perhaps find the hymn is useful by omitting a verse. That does the trick sometimes, doesn't it? I know that people are sometimes quite irritated by textual changes that catch them out. And I could quote an example here in a hymn, Angel Voices Ever Singing, a beautiful hymn. And I know that in some churches where I worship, which use a particular hymn book where they've changed the words in one of the verses, I get quite sort of irritated and anxious as that verse comes up. And I'd feel much happier if they omitted it altogether and we just managed the hymn with 4 verses. You, in your book, have a case study of All Things Bright and Beautiful. And there is an offending verse in there, isn't it? Or a verse that has caused controversy over some time. Would you like to sort of unpack that a little bit?
You're clearly talking about the rich man in his castle. All Things Bright and Beautiful actually existed marvelously without that particular offending verse for possibly 60 years. There's been some doughty defences of that verse. People trying to blame the publishers for leaving out the comma in the middle of the verse, and also the idea that Mrs. Alexander was simply quoting scripture. I think that the hymn exists perfectly serviceably without that verse. I can't imagine it ever going back in to common circulation other than by using it as an illustration and using it in a scholarly way. It does raise some interesting points, though, to acknowledge that there are such verses in hymns. And of course, once a hymn is published, and I make this point several times in my book, once a hymn is published and appears in a hymn book, it is there forever. And if you have the hymn book, then you are free to sing those verses as you choose. In these days of overhead projectors, it's less likely that an offending verse will find its way into a church service, but I think it's a good reason to check through your hymn books every now and again to make sure that you're not singing the words that you may not wish to subscribe to. Although, of course, there are many newer hymns that also contain words that we may not wish to subscribe to. So the fault is not always on the vintage hymns and the older hymns.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. One of the ways in which I encounter vintage hymns is if I'm taking perhaps a marriage service or sadly a funeral service, and often you find it's the older hymns that are being requested, at least before this lockdown, and we weren't able to sing. One of the hymns that comes up with increasing regularity is All Things Bright and Beautiful. We get hymns like Lord of All Hopefulness, Lord of All Joy being very popular. And then there's Amazing Grace. This features quite often in funeral services, I've found. Now, that's a very interesting hymn by John Newton, isn't it, who has a very interesting background, and it's a confessional hymn. I think it's also a hymn that has only relatively recently become popular again. What do you think is the reason for that success?
Well, I think it's a vintage hymn. If ever there was a vintage hymn, it has to be Amazing Grace. It did sort of really come back into public consciousness in, I think it was 2011. There was a film starring Benedict Cumberbatch and Rupert Sewell called Amazing Grace, and that featured the hymn, and it has been used as the hymn itself is really used to show sort of the end and celebrate the end of slavery, although of course it's never been any secret that John Newton himself did deal in slave cargoes. Any biography that you read will never put this to one side, and I think John Newton himself spoke quite openly about what a dreadful thing it was that he had done. Now the hymn has been taken up by a lot of our popular singers. Beyonce has released it both as a solo item and with her group Destiny's Child, and Mika Paris has also sung it. To say nothing of I think Louis Armstrong has even done it. So I think it really has taken on a life as a sort of pop anthem as well. Also, Amazing Grace did appear in that great anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So the idea of singing hymns as an anti-slavery and an anti-repression idea is certainly not new, and the text does appear in its entirety in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And of course, another really important thing about Amazing Grace is it is always sung, particularly in England and the Americas, to the wonderful American tune New England, which I think gives it a poignance and a authority. And I think the reason, just to pull back and go to your original point about wedding hymns, is that people choose for their wedding a hymn that they want to sing and that they think their guests are going to enjoy singing. And what better hymn than Amazing Grace?
No, absolutely. I mean, it is what is known, that is what the couple will often have in mind when they make that choice. And clearly, vintage hymns are more likely to be known than some of the more recent hymns, which are, we have a fantastic selection of contemporary hymns from which to choose when we worship together. But these aren't perhaps quite as well known as the older vintage hymns.
But
It depends how old you are, I suppose.
yes, I was going to say that. It does depend how old you are. And I think that many couples, perhaps in their 30s, coming for marriage and also to baptize their children, will think about the sort of more modern vintage hymns, Colours of Day, I Watch the Sunrise, One More Step. What a nice wedding hymn that is. One more step along the world I go. It's not what some people would call vintage, in the sense that it hasn't been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. But of course, some of these hymns, even Shine Jesus Shine, which a lot of people will be rolling their eyes and saying, oh no, not Shine Jesus Shine. Shine Jesus Shine is actually been around and printed in hymn books for over 30 years. It first appeared in 1989. So I think that's, sort of beginning to show its stripes a bit, whether you like it or not.
Absolutely. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about inclusive language. That particular issue is a hot potato, isn't it, in hymnody and liturgy generally. And we do have some very well-known and much-loved texts that it would be very difficult to alter. I'm just thinking of the opening verse, as we know it, of Whittier's hymn, Dear Lord and Father of Mankind, forgive our foolish ways. Have you? I think that there have been some attempts to make a revision of that line. Of course, as soon as you revise the line, you have to revise all the other lines that follow in rhyme, or where that rhyming pattern follows. Any thoughts about being comfortable about going with a hymn like that?
I think it is very, very difficult. As a worshipping woman, I do find it very frustrating, particularly when people say, "Oh, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter." And I think that women of the world would agree that it does matter, because as not mankind and as not a brother, there's a temptation to feel that one is not included in the battle of for salvation. Having said that, from a purely hymnic point of view, certainly the revision of text is extremely difficult. And there is a point I feel that a hymn is so well known and so deeply rooted in one's psyche and in one's culture that it would actually be almost impossible to rewrite it. And Dear Lord and Father of Mankind is perhaps one of those. And of course, it does have beautiful sentiments later on, and it is sung to a beautiful tune. I can only say that it's best not to choose it if you don't want to sing the mankind bit. But it's an example of a hymn that I can't imagine it ever going out of a hymn book and going out of the tradition, if only as an example of a beautiful hymn and a beautiful part of of course a much longer poem. So it's difficult. I think that the whole scale root and branch rewriting of hymns to take out all the lords and fathers and kings would certainly be very difficult, and we would certainly lose a lot of gems. I think my personal beef is much more with the brothers, and I do use one example in the book specifically, where it's brothers of Christ, we must join together. And I was quite old. I was well into my teens before I realised, hey, I'm being left out of all of this. And I think that there are many young women who would have had the same idea. Of course, lots of modern hymn writers have addressed this, and writers such as Fred Kahn, Brian Wren, Elizabeth Cosnett, our modern hymns have revised their hymns as they go. Brian Wren, in particular, to rewrite to go with the gender neutral language that he particularly aspires to. Fred Kahn too, as his writing progressed. Our older hymn writers, of course, they're not here to speak for themselves. So it's up to careful editors, hymn book editors, to offer us alternatives that we're willing to sing. And who knows, some of these hymns that are rewritten are the vintage hymns of tomorrow. We've already said Hills of the North Rejoice has been around in its new form for 45 years. So let's throw out a challenge. Let's have a new Dear Lord and Father of Mankind by the end of the evening.
I know it seems odd in July to talk about Christmas carols, but carols, hymns, they're certainly vintage, and we are in touch with a huge number of people at Christmas time, aren't we? And there have been various attempts to revise the texts of those great hymns that we're used to singing at Christmas, maybe by using you and your language rather than thee and thy, or, perhaps changing the texts in a more radical way. Do you think that's a dangerous road to go down?
I don't think it's a dangerous road to go down. I think there is a difficulty with tinkering with words that people really love and are only going to sing once or twice a year. These hymns, I'm thinking particularly of Away in a Manger, Once in Royal David City. Those two hymns, they come in for quite a pasting, called, The Usual Suspects and Too Familiar and Sickly Sweet and Why is the Infant Jesus So Good? Surely he should be, sort of as rowdy as any other earthly human. But I don't really think that's the point. I think we have much more of a cultural idea here, to do with tradition and to do with unity. I think if the text does not contain anything that's particularly offensive, so I would sort of say that it would be fine to continue to singing it in the tradition, but that does not mean that people can't offer us alternatives that are equally fresh and equally exciting. I mean, Chris Avis's O Little Town of Nazareth is a wonderful reworking, obviously, of O Little Town of Bethlehem, and it's sung to the same tune, Forest Green, so it allows us to revisit the text in a fresh way. And a text that I quote in full in my book is Sue Gilmurray's wonderful reimagining of Away in a Manger, which she brings right up to date. She has actually composed a new tune, and she intersperses the words of the original with her own verses. But it could also be sung to the familiar rocking tune, Kirkpatrick's. I think it's rocking tune, is it? Cradle Song. That's the one, isn't it? Cradle Song. It's so exciting to come to something fresh. So I think this is a wonderful time. Christmas is a wonderful time for the old and the new to exist side by side.
Well, thank you. Yes, I agree. That was a wonderful part of the book to read, where you had those two texts, not two texts, they complement each other beautifully, the Sue Gilmurray text, along with the old text of Away in a Manger, and worth getting the book for to read that.
And also another point that I do make, I don't want to have too many spoilers because I do want everybody to buy the book, obviously. But I do mention when I went to Romania on a conference, and there was a great Scrabble. I meant in the early part of the century, the 2004, I think it was, and there was a real Scrabble to get around the country to collect up all sorts of different Christmas carols, because they'd been completely suppressed under the communist punitive communist regime. So I think this is an important aspect of Christmas hymn singing and our hymn singing in general, that if we just put all these older hymns aside, we are actually in danger of losing something that we then wish that we hadn't, and then we can't get it back again, the same as everything else that we lose.
Thank you. Yes, you touched earlier on hymns with military images and militaristic ideas. Clearly, "Onward, Christian Soldiers" is a very well-known hymn, a vintage hymn. Yes, surely that. You also mentioned "A Safe Stronghold, Our God is Still," with its very difficult verse right at the end there, which has been revised, and it's often that revised form that you see in our books. I say that you see in our books, and it will depend on your tradition. What I find now is that it's very rarely that you'll get a chance to sing either of those hymns. So actually, some vintage hymns do reach a point beyond which they are sort of seen to be less useful.
Yes, I think that there probably is a time when anything that we love, an item in our house, or there is definitely time to lay it aside. I think also things, for example, earthly warfare has changed so much, and so maybe our hymns no longer reflect the grim reality of war, and now this is where new hymns coming in with our new hymn writers with a strong message of peace and equality are really with hymn writers such as Christopher Idle and Martin Leckerbusch and Andrew Pratt coming in and giving us a new idea, a new way of looking at a warfare and peace, and how we need to find resolution and solution. But it's important, I think, to remember that these hymns, these older hymns, they do still exist somewhere, and that's in our hymn books. And if they're in our hymn books, then we can always turn to them. Two hymns that I particularly like, which do have very strong military images, are "When a Knight Won His Spurs," which again was a great school favourite of mine, and it is a very battle-laden hymn, but I liked it. I remember liking it just because of the idea of story. It's got that wonderful line, "Though back into storyland giants have fled," and it makes me smile, particularly now, because it's contained in Songs of Praise, and Percy Dummer was keen not to include the hobgoblins of He Who Would Valiant Be, on the grounds that the word didn't appear in the Bible. But hey ho, I don't think there were too many dragons in the Bible anyway. But I love "When a Knight Won His Spurs," and I love the tune "Stowy" as well. And another one of my favourite hymns, which is quite militaristic, but more about spiritual battle, is "My Faith It Is an Oaken Staff," which really does talk about the sword and the spirit and going forward and going out, and that's rarely sung now. But although I did choose it yesterday for a service I was leading.
Well done. We've got to leave some time for questions. Just before we go to questions, we've had one or two on the screen coming up, which I'll put to you in a moment. Can we say something about the words? We could have a quite a lengthy debate, I guess, about what's most important, and I think we would probably agree, Gillian, that both are equally important. But the tune can do a wonderful rescue job on a vintage text, can't it? Well, yes, please comment.
I'm going to jump in before you started there. I think it's important to remember that this debate has been raging for many hundreds of years, and even Amazing Grace, when it was first sung, was not sung, of course, to the tune that we're so familiar with now, but was sung to a hymn from Lady Huntingdon, Lady Selina, Countess of Huntingdon, her collection. And I have used that particular example at a number of lectures I've given, and it's not such a good tune in any shape or form to carry those words forward. So certainly a good marriage of tunes is extremely important, and for a hymn writer, a text writer, if you can get your hymn sung to a really good tune, then you're on to a winner. And of course, we've got fine vintage examples, such as Dear Lord and Father of Mankind that you've already mentioned. Jerusalem, of course. Imagine singing that to another tune. And then we've got our more modern examples, such as the Timothy Dudley Smith text, which is
Tell Out My Soul.
Tell Out My Soul. Yes, imagine singing that to a different tune. So I think it's great to have a really good marriage of text and tunes. Having said that, singing a hymn to a different tune can be very refreshing and can really make you think about the words in a new way. And so I wouldn't completely disregard trying out some new tunes. I would urge everyone to rummage through their hymn book and try and find another tune for some of their favourite texts.
The hymn I think of, Gillian, is My Song Is Love Unknown, a 17th century text, a beautiful text, just refreshed completely by John Ireland's tune, 20th century tune.
Yes.
Yeah, there's lots of examples
of
that.
It really is lovely to bring that up to date.
Well, let's. We're approaching. We're just gone 20 to 9. So we've got a question here from Michael, or I think it's a question. It's a statement to start with, and I think we'd agree with this, Gillian. Revising hymns needs to be well done. Jubilati, that's a hymn book publisher, do it well, as one or two in Mission Praise. And then Michael doesn't think quite as highly of the New Methodist Singing the Faith book, which has, in his opinion, some really bad revisions. Commenting on different revisions. Any thoughts on that, Gillian?
Well, it's certainly true, and some are extremely cumbersome. And I think I do mention one or two absolute disasters in my book, and I think some of the attempts to bring language up to date are so clumsy. And it's not always easy to sing. So Lord, thy word abideth, for example, is much easier to sing than Lord, thy word abiding, which we have in With One Voice, the Australian hymn book. You and yours, thee and thous. There's it's very difficult to remember which you've got. You may want to keep with some older text. So I think it is difficult, and maybe it's a good chance to look through, have your hymns on a overhead screen and not use them out of hymn book, so you can pick the version that you like best. I don't like God Rest You Merry Gentlefolk, for example. I don't even know who gentlefolk are. There's all sorts of things, and then leaving in really difficult words rather than taking them out. So yes, Michael, I agree with you. There are some terrible ones.
Michael also has a follow-up on that. He asks us if we know the Mission Praise version of As With Gladness, men of old, of course, where he believes that the compilers of Mission Praise or the editors of Mission Praise have completely ruined that by going to your language. It's fair to say, isn't it, that actually in some hymns and carols, the use of you in particular and your can appear to be very intrusive. O come all you faithful, for example.
Yes, and of course that's undoubtedly true. It does make it, and it makes it difficult to remember. It makes it difficult to join in with. But also the other thing, which I think is perhaps more important, is this arbitrarily bringing things up to date seems to be rather strange, because we do hold on to older language in other capacities. I mean, obviously Shakespeare, some translations of the Bible people favour, and there are plenty of people who would say to have an older text is part of our heritage. People quite happily sing older versions, so there isn't actually any need to bring them up to date, other than as some kind of academic exercise. I mean, but I mean, everybody so loves things like "As with gladness, men of old." I'll look it up, Michael, as soon as afterwards, see if I can find it.
Okay, well, thank you, Michael, for those questions. Now we have a question from Janet, who talks about Brian Wren, the United Reformed Church hymn writer. Brian Wren writes about Mother God, but alongside Father God. And it is strong Mother God and warm Father God, which challenges stereotypes.
Oh yeah, yes. I mean, it's certainly very important. Brian Wren has written extensively about making sure that the delicate flower of womanhood can stand equally alongside the fighting spirit of the male, and it's very interesting to break out of that mold, and very important to break out of that mold. I think all sorts of examples. There's hymns that I mentioned in the book that really do suggest that only men are fit for the path of battle, and women are just innocent bystanders that are forced to stay at home, wringing their hands. And I do think that hymns that do challenge that are important to sing and important to find in our hymn books. Yeah, so good. Well done, Brian Wren. Excellent.
Well, thank you. We haven't any other questions at the moment, and we ought to be thinking of bringing this session to a close shortly. But can we just say something about the fact that for the past 15 months we've been unable to sing in churches and in our gatherings? Well, some of us have recently started to begin singing outside once again, and that's been a great blessing. And I'm sure that all of us are looking forward to that hugely. Do you think things will have changed at all, Gillian? Will there be any renewed attitudes of enthusiasm as we approach our singing once again?
I think everybody's going to be really looking forward to singing again. I think a lot of the old favourites will be coming out as fast as possible, and I think some of the new favourites will be coming out as fast as possible. I think people will be raring to go, tuning up their guitars, tinkling their ivories. I think that there will be a lot of excitement, and I think church choirs of however many they are, and whatever their age is, whatever their experience, boys, girls, men, women, will be looking forward to singing, and I bet they just can't wait. And I hope all their voices are okay, because my voice has really suffered, unfortunately. So I need to do some serious voice exercises.
I think it'll take some time for us to get back into good shape singing wise.
Yes, but it's going
it
to
will
be
worth it.
it's going to be wonderful, and what a great sound it's going to be. And I hope all churches, and all Christian groups and all groups of school children will be singing whatever they're going to sing, old or new, with enjoyment, and sing lustily and with a good courage, as John Wesley said.
Gillian, that's a wonderful place to end, I think. Word of thanks to Sacristy Press for hosting this book launch tonight. We're very grateful to you. And of course, we're grateful to Sacristy Press for publishing Gillian's book. Here we are, using vintage hymns in worship. And you can obtain that by going onto the online site there, or it's obtainable from most good Christian booksellers at the very reasonable price of £9.99. So I hope you've enjoyed this session, and we're very, very grateful to Gillian for her book and for all that she shared with us tonight. So thank you all for joining in. Bless you all, and let's look forward to singing hymns, vintage, old and new, when we return again to our worship. Thank you all very much indeed.